Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with Astra Taylor?
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know?
Maybe. Yes, you can. It's me.
It's wonderful. Astra, it's Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes, and I'm so delighted that you can take the time to talk to us. It's really wonderful to speak to you now. Tell me, how have you been living these last 11 months of this delirious time? If you can tell me something about it, maybe low points, high points, and middle points.
Well, Paul, at first, the thing is, you're one of the last human beings I saw in the flesh.
Yes. Before
the pandemic hit. So I'm having,
1 year ago.
Sort of time warp, hearing your voice talking on the phone. I mean, how have I been? I have been okay, all things considered. And I have been, very digitized. In fact, what happened right before you called, about 10 minutes before, is I somehow very violently dropped my phone and broke it. So I'm actually talking to you on my computer. Luckily, the call routed through my laptop. So I think I had this sense of, almost like relief when I picked up my phone and I realized that it was just broken. And it turned this beautiful electric blue, but a very impractical electric blue. And the sense that maybe I've been a little bit, tied to this device because it's the portal through which I live. So I don't know if that says something about where my head is at. I want freedom from the digital world.
It does say something. What does it say for you?
I think it says that, I think there's part of me that, I'm an activist, I'm an organizer, I'm a documentarian, I'm someone who loves to interview people just like you do. That's something we share. So I'm always trying to reach out to the world. And so we're reaching out virtually a lot of the time. But there's something also, very, we all know this, right? That our devices are also sources of stress and anxiety and bad news. And so I think, I want, especially as we enter a new year, and so you have new aspirations for oneself, I guess, to kind of, experience more of the actual world around me and a little bit less of the mediated world.
True. I always think of Thoreau, who said we've become the tools of our tools.
Yes, that rings a little bit too true.
But, you were referencing something, and I feel that maybe for our listeners it would be interesting for them to know how it is that 1 year ago, nearly to this day, we were together in Los Angeles. You came out to the Ola House, to the Onassis LA, and we did something together. And perhaps you could describe what it is we did, and maybe I can start you out, as you would imagine, with a quotation that might set it up. David Graeber recently died, and I know we're both very sad about that. He said something that I think in a way speaks very clearly to the kind of gathering we had 1 year ago here in Los Angeles. He said, "Debt is just a promise corrupted by mathematics and violence."
Yeah, it's a beautiful line from David, a man who really knew how to write. In fact, David Graeber was a good friend of mine. I went back and I tried to remember, how did our friendship begin? And it began with emails, and almost immediately we began writing these long letters to each other. 2010. And my last message to David was actually just telling him how much I appreciated his prose and the the fact that he not only had brilliant ideas and incredibly empathetic, profound politics, but that he could write really well. And he responded and he said, "Thanks, Astra." And then he said, I call it being nice to the reader. You know, we're trying, every act of writing is an attempt to communicate. And I just thought there was something about that. You know, he wasn't even that he saw himself as such a great prose stylist, but he saw it as an act of generosity and kindness and trying to bring people, you know, on board with him and on a journey with him. So one of the journeys David brought me on was the journey of becoming an organizer around debt. David is obviously known for his international best-selling book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, because he is nothing if not ambitious. But he was someone who was both he's an intellectual and an activist. And I think, you know, to people, those terms, you know, we have to specify, he was both, because a lot of people who are intellectuals sit in the armchair in the library. There's a kind of sense of being a bit removed from the world. You know, and I think David and I and a lot of the people we admire both really think that there's actually incredible intellectual excitement and engagement in struggle, in working to change the world and sort of trying to put your ideals into practice and in that kind of collective endeavor that is activism. So David invited me to join a nascent debt resistance movement during the early days of Occupy Wall Street in 2011. It led to the formation of something that he wasn't around for. He had gone off to London, but something called the Debt Collective, which is a union for debtors that I co-founded with friends who I had met at Occupy, and you know, many of whom had also been recruited by David Graeber to the movement. Long story short, we found our way to OLA to you, and you know, your Center for Dialogue seems like the perfect place to have dialogue around debt. And, you know, and Paul, I think it's quite interesting to reflect now, right, a year after we did the event, and to see that the idea we hatched together has come to fruition. So our idea on the phone, and it was an idea that actually was born on a telephone call with you and your collaborators and some of mine. And we said, well, you know, what if we filled the room with interesting people who were both rooted in the movement that I'm part of, the movement against unfair debts, the movement for what we call debt abolition, right? We want people to not have to be in debt for things like education, healthcare, housing. And we see the way debt is a form of inequality and exploitation in this world. But what if we put this movement in conversation with academics, scholars, people who have been thinking about the university and the problems of education today, the way that education has been privatized, turned into a commodity, people who have thought about the racial justice implications of that. You know, what if we had around 20 really interesting people having a dialogue and both learning about the crisis of higher education in this country, specifically around student debt, but then also started to ask, well, what is to be done? And started to really brainstorm and engage and learn together. And so we gathered that group of people, February 7th, 2020, with the plan that we would both have an encounter that was meaningful in the space to the participants, but that we would also film it. And that I would direct a film about it. At the time, I thought, okay, there's no way I won't get 15 minutes of interesting footage. That was my goal. But I think, you know, now we have a 45-minute, pretty interesting film that I think will have actually a decently long life, because it communicates a lot of ideas and possibilities that are actually even more resonant in this moment in what's about, you know, in February 2021 than they were a year ago.
I'm really excited that you talk about this year that has passed, because when we spoke 1 year ago, when you convened the various people you convened here, the idea hadn't yet taken hold in the way it has now. And now you have a film that people can watch. Now you have The Intercept helping along. You have various movie theaters and Sundance and various organizations that are behind it. And I find that very promising, that an idea that was nascent in a way now has taken hold. And just 1 month ago, you wrote a very interesting piece in The Nation, The Case for Wide-Scale Debt Relief. And I will read the first paragraph so that people get a sense also of your style. You were talking about David Graeber's style, but your style, serious, and at the same time, it ends on a note of some levity. Even before COVID arrived, total household debt in the United States had reached a record-breaking 14 trillion, the result of decades of stagnating wages and slashed social services. The pandemic only reinforces the reality that mass indebtedness is a structural problem, the result of a system that forces people to borrow in order to make ends meet, rather than of poor individual choices. Millennials, in other words, are not drowning in student loans because of a collective penchant for avocado toast.
Avocado toast is good, though.
It is good, but exactly that's why probably you put that in. So explain to us how you've borrowed all this money for education. Mm-hmm. Why should you be forgiven? And should everybody be forgiven? Should people who actually can afford to pay be forgiven? Or should education just be something that should be for free?
Yeah, I mean, these are the questions that we get to in this film we made at Onassis, right? And it's the title of the film is "You Are Not Alone." And it's A space LOAN. So alone is in the financial device. But we like the double entendre of it, which is you are also not alone, as you are not the only one in your situation, right? So there are 45 million student debtors in the United States. Did each one of those 45 million people just make they just made terrible mistakes? They just somehow failed to really comprehend compound interest and no, when something is that massive, when you have 45 million people all in the same boat, it's because of a structural issue. It's because that's actually the way the economy is set up. So one phrase that is actually from the Debt Collective book, which we just published maybe 6 months ago, it's called Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition. One line from that book, which we were actually working on when we were there with you, is, we are not in debt because we live beyond our means. We are indebted because we are denied the means to live. So we're in debt because we have a very basically quasi-privatized education system in this country. So the average student borrower graduates from college with $35,000 of student debt, and then that for certain people that just balloons because of interest. The United States is buried in medical debt, unlike many other advanced countries, because we don't have universal health care. This is the only country where thousands and thousands and thousands of people every year go bankrupt because of their medical bills, because they got cancer, or because one of their family members got sick. So we have a crisis of debt that is not it's not a personal issue, it's a political issue. And as I said in the Nation piece, this is a problem the pandemic has worsened, because when tens of millions of jobs evaporate, you have people who are even more dire financial straits, even more
vulnerable. And healthcare is completely connected to having a job.
100%, which is very strange. I mean, this is the way the U.S. does it, right? So 15 million people lost their healthcare because they lost their job.
When they need it most.
Exactly. So I want to dig into the word that you use, which is debt forgiveness. So if, we challenge that word. I personally challenge that word. And David really, was big on challenging this word. Debtors don't need to be forgiven. So if you have gone into deep medical debt because you or a loved one was sick, that's not something you should be blamed for. So you don't need forgiveness. So, and we believe student debtors are in the same boat. If you're seeking an education, not just so you can get ahead in life, right, but actually because you want to learn, because you're a curious human being, you want to engage subject matter that matters, that matters to you, or that might expand your horizons, or maybe that, you want to find out, actually, I'm not interested in that. I think that's part of living a full life. And that's something that we should be entitled to. And in fact, higher education used to be much more affordable and even free. So I object to the word forgiveness, and that's why the debt collective uses the word abolition, or we sometimes use the language of cancellation. So the morality of debt is always pointing towards the debtor as blameworthy. And I want to flip the script and say, actually, it's the system that's to blame because we're not giving people what they need. And on those grounds, yes, I'll just be very blunt and I'll say, yes, cancel it all, because these are odious debts for things like education, healthcare, I would say even housing are debts that we, shouldn't have. And we should be financing our society in a very different way. I'm not so worried about a few rich people getting their debts canceled, though, because I think that, ultimately, if you're really rich, if you're the child of a millionaire or a billionaire, you probably don't have student loans.
Does it make economic sense, though, to cancel debt?
It makes a lot of economic sense because if you cancel the debt, you get all of that money that's going to pay people's debt circulating in the economy. So, people, I think on average, people are spending $300 or $400 a month on their student loans. And instead of sending that to the government, which doesn't need it, the federal government doesn't need those dollars to function. It would be going to other things. You could be spending it at local businesses that are struggling. You could be using it to start your own business. So there's a lot of data that says that debt inhibits people. And what this really means is it makes people less prone to take risks. So people are less likely to start their own enterprises. They're less likely to follow their dreams, whether that's being an artist or reinventing themselves. They're less likely to move somewhere that they've never been. There's a psychological effect to debt that really holds people back. And so it would also benefit people because, for example, there's always this idea like, oh, we can't cancel debt because a rich doctor or a lawyer might get their debts canceled. And the thing is, I think that's not thinking about the problem in a social perspective, because I actually want young lawyers to have their debts canceled so they can go work for public service, so they can go be public defenders, so they can work for nonprofits, so they can work, with labor unions, and where they can work as immigration lawyers. The problem of student debt, one of the problems of student debt is that it forces people into corporate law. Doctors come out of medical school owing $200, $300, $400. I know someone personally who owes $600,000 from medical school. This pushes people into more quote unquote prestigious, high paying sectors instead of being a family doctor, a general practitioner in a poor community. So there are all of these socially pernicious effects, and we have to click out of the mindset. The whole thing is we have to click out of this individual mindset where we think, oh, well, your education was your investment so you could get a career and get ahead. It's like, no, education is a public concern. We want our fellow human beings, whether they're citizens or not, but the people we are in a community with, to be able to learn, to be able to pursue public interest careers without this burdensome debt. And we want, an educated citizenry. We want people who are kind of have a background where they've engaged with a broad array of ideas and have kind of like a broad education they can apply to life. I mean, this is something that is about the whole society, not just individuals and whether they can get a good job and pay off their debts.
And this is about a whole human being. And this brings me back to Astra as a very, very young person who was in a nutrient-rich environment, as she says, well-stocked with food, books, and musical instruments. So you grew up in a family that, I don't know if they read Ivan Illich, but it feels like they must have read Ivan Illich. Deschooling Society came to mind as I was preparing to speak with you, Astra. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about those early years where, I mean, it reminded me so much of a moment in my life where my father would say to me, the more interests you have, the more interesting you are. Or before going to university, he said to me, the word university comes from the word universe. And so I'm curious, because I think in a way there's a real correlation between your fight now to free people from debt and your early years as someone who followed their bliss, as it were?
I really love your father's quote. It's related to something my mother used to always say. So I love this. The more interest you have, the more interesting you are. That's a very nice way to put it.
Isn't it?
So I appreciate your dad's spirit. My mom would say, when you're bored, you're boring.
Right.
When you're bored, you're boring. And she would say that.
And you know, Astra, I've never really been bored, because the minute I'm bored, I ask myself why I'm bored, and it's already so interesting to think about that.
Right. What is boredom? Does it have its uses? I mean, I think it does, right? Boredom is what you pass through before you find out what you're interested in, at least pursuing, right? To see if you might be interested in it. I mean, Ivan Illich, so you definitely identified a strand there. Ivan Illich wrote a book called Deschooling Society that my mother probably read when she was a young teenager. So in the early 70s, when my mom was like 13 or 14, I have a relatively young mother. My mom was born in 1960. She went to one of these free schools that were spreading across North America in the 1960s and early 70s. And she went to this school in the Yukon Territory that the kids helped run. They didn't totally run the place, but the kids had a very strong democratic say over how the school was managed, over the curriculum. And so she was part of the committee on pedagogy. I mean, and my mom must have been 13 at the time. And this is way, way up north, right? in the hinterlands. And she went there for a year, and it left a big impression on her. And she took some of these ideas, including Illich's idea of deschooling, into our household. And we actually grew up in Athens, Georgia, which is a liberal college town, but it's in the South. And we were quite rare because we called ourselves unschoolers. And that's it's a very different thing than being a homeschooler. So there were homeschoolers in Georgia because this is something the religious right does, where parents don't want their kids to be subjected to, secular thoughts or really exposed to the outside world. So it's a very protective thing. You're going to have this very controlled curriculum in the home with a parent, typically the mother, serving in the teacher's role. Unschooling, in contrast, was about being open to the world and saying, the school is too closed off. The world is your classroom. And hell, who needs a teacher? Be your own teacher. And so as a kid growing up, there were, no bedtimes, no alarm clocks, no tests. There were lots of books around and lots of instruments and lots of encouragement. But it was almost frowned upon. Like at certain points, I wanted a teacher. I wanted, piano lessons or something. And it was like, well, if you really wanted to play, you'd figure it out. And I think it has really shaped me. It shaped my desire. I mean, I have criticism isn't quite the word, but I don't think my childhood experience would totally scale. I'm someone who's fighting for really robustly funded public quality education. But I think at the center of my personal vision of education is not just free as in cost, that it should be free for all and it shouldn't cause you to have this horrible debt hanging over you, but that it should be aimed at freedom. It should be free as in liberation, as in giving you the space to really be this curious person who learns about the world, and that education shouldn't have to be instrumentalized, right? It shouldn't be just about career training. I mean, having a good career is great. Having a job you like is great. But I feel that for me, intellectual pursuits can't just be instrumentalized. It's not just about putting it to use. It's also about, letting it be, and having that aspect of curiosity, which I think is just so central to being human. And so it's very striking to me, and this is in the film, You Are Not Alone, that Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of California in the late 60s, he was very, very critical in attacking free public higher education, in imposing a system of student debt. And he did so because he said, and this is a quote, that the state should not be in the business of subsidizing curiosity. And I'm someone who's just militantly pro-curiosity, and I think the state should subsidize it. That's my mission.
It's an extraordinary quotation. Reading about your background and about it isn't really an unruly childhood, but it's a childhood where you could really follow, as I understand it, your whims, and it made me think of that wonderful line of Twain, and I'm wondering how it hits you right now, where he says, "I have never let my schooling interfere with my education."
I love that, right? And I think for me, the schooling I've had, and I've had some formal schooling. So at 13, I thought, well, hell, I'll go to public school. I want to see how the other 99% lives. And then at 16, I enrolled early in college. And, I actually, and I have a master's degree. I'm credentialed. But, compared to the average, person, I've spent a lot less time in the classroom. And I think, I always felt that, somehow my vision of what a university should be, right? That it should contain the universe, again, to go back to your dad's point, and that it should be almost like a very reverential place, never kind of lived up to my reality, never lived up to my ideals, I suppose, because school was school, right? I mean, high school was as much about teaching us and preparing us for adulthood as it was just about making sure we weren't on the streets and kind of babysitting us until our parents got off work. And college, again, also was, very competitive and kind of, when limited, I thought, in its approach. And, people, again, it's, very much about being able to get ahead and get a job where you can pay off your student debt. And so I think there is a disconnect between schooling and education. At the same time, I revere education. I mean, when we gathered at Onassis House, there are just brilliant scholars. There are brilliant historians. We have Wendy Brown, the political theorist. We have Stephanie Kelton, brilliant economist, who is just changing public perception right now and completely reinventing the discipline. We had Barbara Ransby, just an incredible historian of the civil rights era. We had all of this knowledge. And so I'm someone who, even though I have my criticisms of how schooling is structured, I really do, revere that kind of intellectual depth, specialization, expertise, we could call it. I've built my career around it, even though I'm not an academic. And so I want to democratize access to that kind of deep knowledge and that kind of authority, because I think it's something we all have a right to.
But it's so interesting during this pandemic. Of course, we're all caught up with Zoom here, Zoom there. I heard somebody once say cogito ergo Zoom. And recently, I spoke with Naomi Klein, and she wrote a very interesting piece called Screen New Deal, and she quotes something, and I'd love you to react to this. She talks about a CEO called Anuja Sonalker of Steer Tech, a Maryland-based company selling self-parking technology, and she wrote a pitch where she says there has been a distinct warming up to humanless, contactless technology. Humans are biohazards, machines are not. And to take that in the direction of education, now there seems to be that the pandemic in a way opened up a possibility for schools to think, well, maybe we should teach this way. Maybe we should teach remotely. Why get together?
I mean, it's interesting because I think there are advantages sometimes of not having to get together, right? Because over Zoom, we can speak. We're far away from each other. You can tune into a lecture that's on the other side of the globe. I mean, on some level, I've been to some incredible events in the last 11 months because I've been able to tune in. The problem is when we want to, instead of using that as a supplement, right, to the richness of in-person learning and seminars and the kind of slowness of a kind of study. It's when you want to replace it with this, with digital, contactless education. And so I think it's all about what purpose are we ultimately trying to serve? I mean, if the purpose is ultimately just to cut costs, which is what a lot of educational institutions are after, both colleges and universities and also, K through 12. If the purpose is to cut costs, well, then you're just going to get the crappiest version of digital learning, right? You're also going to get the crappiest version of in-person learning. And so in that sense, are we using technology to advance austerity, to
Right.
advance a kind of withering away of these public services, or are we actually deploying technology in a really interesting way that is an enhancement to something that is, robust, where the teacher-student ratio is not incredibly high, right, where people can actually have that human contact. It's when we want to, it's ultimately, this is something I wrote about in my book, The People's Platform, which is a book about technology that I wrote and published in 2014 is, it's not, the problem typically isn't the technology for me, it's the underlying business model. It's the business incentives it's serving.
Right. And
Yeah.
and are we, if we move in that direction, are we getting
Mm-hmm.
further and further away from the commons?
100%. Absolutely. I mean, and you see, I have a few, there's one really interesting example, but first, one word you said, I think, was efficiency too. I think we are always deploying technology to make things more efficient. I think we just really have to be careful about the spaces where actually inefficiency is welcome, right? It's okay for things to be slower. It's okay for things to take time. Friction is not always bad. Sometimes it means we're working through problems. And I think, but instead it's sort of, technology is always, how can we get this faster? How can we have this be seamless, frictionless? And that's, I don't think that's always a virtue. But to your point about the commons, I mean, 100%. I mean, every internet platform, every internet space we go to all day, with the exception of Wikipedia, is a privately owned space. It's the digital equivalent of a shopping mall. And then the sites that we do go to that are public are often literally made to break. They're made poorly on purpose. And I can give you a really vivid example.
Please.
The Debt Collective, which is the union for debtors I mentioned, that was, how when we had come to see you, we were in a period where we were wrapping up a first strike that started in 2015, where we organized with people who had been defrauded by predatory for-profit colleges. Even calling these companies colleges gives them too much credit and virtue. These predatory companies that indebt people and give them these bogus degrees. So we figured out that people had a right. And the problem was there was no way for them to exercise this right. There was no way for them to submit to the federal government, to the Department of Education, the paperwork to say, I was defrauded. I legally am entitled to get my loans canceled. So the Debt Collective built an app that you could use on your mobile phone. We made it very easy. And we submitted hundreds of thousands of these claims as a result, and won over $1 billion of debt relief through this process. Then the Department of Education basically was like, well, damn it, we're going to have to give people a way to do this as well. So they redesigned their website, and they budgeted $90 million to do this redesign. Well, so basically, a whistleblower came out a few months ago, just in 2020, and said that this redesign that cost $90 million of taxpayer money was scuttled, right? It was canceled because it, quote unquote, made the website too user-friendly. It was too easy to use, so they broke it because they don't want there to be. I mean, so that's one way that technology is used to undermine the commons. They're actually literally building technology that is frustrating, that isn't user-friendly, that doesn't work for people, it doesn't let them enact their rights, and in this case, their rights to have their debt canceled because they were defrauded. And they make instead this, digital mess. So that's the public internet that we know. It's like the website that crashes when you're trying to get your unemployment insurance, whatever. And meanwhile, you go on Amazon and you're like, oh, this works really great. I can get anything I want tomorrow.
It's very convenient. And
Yep.
what interested me is you're talking about rhythm. You're talking about slowing down. And of course, the pandemic to some extent for some people has been that moment, perhaps that portal where we've actually recognized that maybe we need to take more time, slow down, notice what's around us. And you mentioned at the very beginning that we both chat for a living in one form or another, and we talk to people. We believe in some way that conversation leads to maybe some ideas. And I'm curious, Astra, if you give a lot of thought to the idea of listening, and I always think about that one wonderful quotation from John Cage where he says the act of listening is in fact an act of composing.
Yeah. Well, he certainly taught us that it is, right? I mean, that's one of the brilliant gifts of Cage. Listening. You know, it's interesting. I don't know if I ever shared with you, though, on this issue of time and temporality, because we were talking about different words back in the day, a year ago. And one thing I discovered is that actually the etymological root of the word school is the Greek word skole. And it doesn't mean, information building or something like that. It actually means free time, suspension, and delay. So it means this space, this temporality, right? A slowing down so that then you can contemplate. I just thought that was really interesting, that actually that idea of needing to slow down is actually inherent in the original meaning of the word school. It shouldn't be a place actually where the bell rings every 45 minutes and you're rushing off and you never really have enough time to get really deep into something, that beautiful feeling of immersion, right? Where you're really in the flow and engaging with a text or a project or a concept or something like that. I think just the way that time is devalued and isn't really recognized as a part of the learning process. Listening is also, for me, the sort of unloved counterpart of speech. And listening is something that, is so essential when you are someone who's engaged in the practice of interviewing, right? Or dialogue the way you are. I mean, it's interesting when we say the word dialogue. I mean, for me, and I think that just shows how American I am, right? But I just picture somebody's mouth. I picture the speaker. I picture the person at the podium. I have to remind myself, hold on, there's also this, speech doesn't matter if there's no one to listen to it, no one to actually grapple with it and to reflect and respond to it. And so listening is something that, I think a lot about when I'm making films. I thought a lot about it I thought a lot about it when we were shooting You Are Not Alone. I thought a lot about it when I was making my film, What is Democracy, which came out in 2018. And I actually wrote an essay in the New Yorker. It was the first piece of 2020 of mine that was published called The Right to Listen. And it's a kind of provocation that says, hold on, we always think about the right, my free speech rights, my right to speak. And it's like, well, what does it say about us that we don't also think about our right to listen or our duty to listen and who is listened to? And it's a lot easier to blab than to listen. I mean, listening is really hard work. And what makes it even harder is that we don't respect it.
My mother, since I mentioned my father, my mother said to me when I was about 11 years old, she said, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And I'm sure, she said that to me because I was not listening. And I'm wondering what the connection you see between listening and your sustained interest in democracy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for me, listening is connected also to this idea of curiosity and learning, right? It's about it. Listening is that receptivity that you need if you're going to be curious. If you're going to be, but if you're curious about the world, right? So then you listen to what other people have to say, or reading is a kind of listening in its own way. And so it's something, for me that is also, as I've made my way through the world and I engage in intellectual themes. I'm not an academic, but I do rather kind of nerdy work. And, over the years, I think I've pondered, well, what is my ideal of an intellectual? And for me, it's not someone who just has the right answers or, is constantly offering these dazzling utterances. So I love a dazzling utterance. I won't say no to one, but actually it's someone who listens and someone who pays attention to the world. And as I worked more and more on the theme of democracy, I also saw how central listening must be, because if we're really going to have dialogue, if we're going to have anything that qualifies as deliberation, if we're going to have that decision making, because inherent in the idea of democracy is that we, the people, rule ourselves. We are learning, deciding as a collective. Well, that means we're going to have to be able to listen to one another. It's not just about having strong opinions and making we always have this cliche, right? I'm going to make my voice heard. And that's great. I do a lot of that as an activist with the Debt Collective. I shout a lot of slogans and I write a lot of op-eds. But listening is, again, it's just the under-theorized, underappreciated component to democracy. It's a really part of organizing too, like as an activist. Any actually talented union organizer will say, if you want to organize a factory, you don't walk in there and start yelling at people and saying, this is what you got to do. You actually go in there and say, well, hold on, what's it like to work here? How do you feel? Is there anything you would change? Do you think you could change it? And you listen to people. That's how you start. If you really want to build a movement that people feel truly part of. So I just find it so interesting that we, free speech, the First Amendment, we go on and on and on and on and on about it. And that listening gets like nothing. It gets almost no attention. There's a few books about it. But I just think it's there's such a telling absence there, right? The aporia speaks volumes.
In closing, do you have a feeling, Astra, that with this new administration, we're coming into an administration that will do a better job in that sphere of listening?
I think it's interesting. We definitely have an administration that's more inclined to pretend it's listening. You can definitely imagine Joe Biden saying, I hear you, or going on a kind of listening tour. So I mentioned that in the essay, how some politicians kind of perform a kind of listening as part of their, shtick. Mark Zuckerberg famously went on a listening tour, but, really he was just sort of doing a series of photo ops with quote unquote regular people. I certainly think this administration is a far better place to begin the work that we need to do than the last one, right? I'm like so many people breathing an enormous sigh of relief, because what I feel is that we have an administration where we might be able to convince some of them to listen, and we might be able to push some of them to act, to take action. And that's ultimately, part of why I'm so happy that the film that we shot in February of 2020 at the Onassis House, part of what I'm so happy it's coming out at this moment is because we've launched a new strike. So we've launched this strike called the Biden Jubilee 100. 100 people inspired by those debt strikers I mentioned before who refused to pay their loans from predatory for-profit colleges. Inspired by that campaign, a new group of people have said that they won't pay, and they're demanding the Biden administration cancel all student debt. And we're trying to tell their stories in a way that will encourage people to listen, to really hear and to recognize just how much harm is being done. The way that these people, because of these incredible debt loads, the way they can't plan for their future, they can't care for their families, right? The way that it's diminishing so much of their potential. But then we also know that, it's not enough to just tell our stories. We actually have to build the power. So we also have to be disruptive. We have to be annoying. We have to be critical of people. And that's what we're doing.
And solidarity is so important in that regard.
Yeah. Solidarity also, let's not forget that solidarity is actually a word that relates to debt. So solidarity has very ancient roots. It comes from the ancient Latin concept of a debt being held in solidum. So what would happen is a group of farmers would they would hold a debt together. Not what they were said to hold a debt in solidum. That's the root of the term we now use, solidarity. So it was a state of mutual indebtedness. And one farmer had a bad crop, well, everyone else would step up and pay. In the sense that, we are materially bound to each other, right? That we have to cover for each other. So I love that's what solidarity means if you trace it back thousands of years. And I hope that people who don't have debt will be in solidarity with these folks. I don't have any student debt, I should say. And yet I'm in solidarity with them, because the thing is, I don't believe in a world where people are punished and penalized for wanting to learn, for wanting to be the curious human beings I think we're all entitled to be.
Astra, what a pleasure it has been speaking to you. I really thank you so much, and I hope people feel inspired by the words they heard. And I look forward to when you come back next and we can actually be in touch with each other, as it were. It's really been a pleasure to hear you and to speak to you at this moment. So thank you so much, and I hope all of our listeners will watch the film and read your work and listen carefully.
Thank you, Paul. It's been an honor.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.